When people talk about artificial intelligence, they usually do one of two things. They either get hypnotized by the magic or they get distracted by the noise. I have seen this movie before. The names change, the machines change, the slogans change, the sales pitch gets updated for the current decade. But human behavior does not change very much. Capital still chases what looks exponential. Executives still tell themselves that being early excuses being undisciplined. Bankers still find a way to finance what sounds inevitable. Investors still confuse technological possibility with economic return. And ordinary people still arrive at the party after the price of admission has already been set by somebody else. That is why I have always tried to separate two questions that most people insist on mixing together. The first question is whether a technology is real. The second question is whether the financial model built around that technology makes any sense. Those are not the same question. Railroads were real. Electrification was real. Highways were real. Fiber networks were real. The internet was real. All of those things changed. But that did not stop capital from behaving foolishly around them. In fact, the very reality of the technology often made the financial mistakes worse, because once people felt certain that the future had arrived, they stopped asking what price was being paid for that future and who exactly would earn an adequate return on the money being spent. I have spent most of my life studying not only businesses, but the emotional patterns that appear whenever progress gets wrapped in leverage, prestige, fear of missing out, and the promise of a world that is supposedly about to change overnight. What I see in artificial intelligence right now is not a simple story. It is not as shallow as saying this will change everything, and it is not as shallow as saying it is all fake. The technology is remarkable. It will matter. It is already useful in many narrow and expanding ways, but the financial superstructure being built around it has all the markings of what happens when people stop thinking like owners and start thinking like gamblers standing underneath a giant scoreboard. The thing that interests me most is not the chatbot on the screen. It is the concrete behind the screen. It is the steel, the cooling systems, the power demand, the chips, the debt, the equity issuances, the private capital, the government excitement, the accounting assumptions, the replacement cycle, and the astonishing leap of faith that says all of this spending will somehow work itself out because the technology feels inevitable. That is not analysis. That is hope wearing a necktie. When I hear somebody say that all we need to do is imagine a small rate of improvement and let compounding handle the rest, I understand the logic. I have made my whole life around the power of compounding. A business that improves a little year after year becomes a different creature after a decade. A management team that allocates capital rationally for a long time produces a result that looks magical to people who only watch quarterly earnings. So I am not dismissing the argument that even a modest rate of improvement in AI can lead to enormous capability over time. I think that part is probably right. The problem is that capability and profitability are cousins, not twins. A machine can become dramatically more useful while the owners of the infrastructure behind it earn miserable returns. A product can become essential to society while the capital poured into building its ecosystem gets burned up in competition. Overcapacity, rapid obsolescence, and pricing that never catches up to the original excitement. That is the difference between admiring the invention and underwriting the balance sheet. If you want to understand why I am cautious, start with the simplest historical pattern in the whole affair. Whenever a society commits an enormous share of its productive output to infrastructure buildouts, trouble follows. Not because infrastructure is worthless, but because the frenzy around infrastructure tends to outrun the economics. The old examples are familiar if you care enough to study them. Rail tracks spread across countries before the business model had settled, Electrification required tremendous spending before returns normalized. Highway systems absorbed massive capital before the benefits were fully translated into durable profits for the people writing the checks. Fiber buildouts became a monument to the difference between genuine long-term utility and terrible timing for investors. There is a brutal pattern in these episodes. The country may ultimately benefit. Society may even be transformed for the better. But the owners who financed the transformation at peak enthusiasm do not necessarily get rewarded. That distinction matters more than ever today, because this generation has managed to create an infrastructure boom with a built-in decay cycle. If you build train tracks, they can serve you for generations. If you build roads, they can serve you for decades. If you build communication lines, you may get many years of productive life out of the system. But if you build vast AI data centers filled with advanced computing hardware, you are not building cathedrals. You are building warehouses of rapidly aging machinery. The boxes inside those buildings do not sit there for 50 years. They age more like consumer electronics than like bridges. They get superseded. They get replaced. They demand new capital. They demand new power. They demand a new round of justification. And the cycle restarts long before the original spending has emotionally settled in the minds of the people who approved it. That is what makes this period so dangerous. People are talking about permanent strategic advantage while spending into assets that may face a 3 or 4 year effective replacement cycle. There is no poetry in that. There is only depreciation. And depreciation is a very unforgiving truth when the original capital outlay was justified by heroic assumptions. You can call a data center a marvel if you like. I would call it a very expensive promise with a short memory. I have seen people become intoxicated by scale itself. They start talking as if sheer size proves wisdom. They say $650 billion as though the number is so large it must mean the future has already decided in their favor. But a large expenditure is not a moat. A large expenditure is just a large expenditure. If the end user is not willing to pay enough, if the usage economics do not support the capital stack, if the output is commoditized faster than the input can be amortized, then the entire exercise becomes a monument to misallocated confidence. That is the part most people do not want to discuss. They would rather talk about what the machine can do than what the customer will pay. They would rather talk about adoption than margins. They would rather talk about disruption than return on invested capital. They would rather talk about intelligence than billing. But eventually the bill arrives anyway. You can give every person in the country a dazzling device and still fail financially if almost nobody is willing to pay enough to support the system that gave it to them. That is the absurdity I see in the current climate. We are spending at infrastructure scale while monetizing at consumer subscription psychology. That mismatch is the whole story. If the majority of people love the experience but refuse to pay serious money for it, and if the minority who will pay are nowhere near enough to justify the industrial base being erected underneath them, then somebody is financing a future that may be socially useful and privately disastrous. That is why I do not dismiss the possibility that sometime around the end of this decade, people wake up and discover that the economic dream attached to AI infrastructure was built on assumptions that never deserved the confidence they received. Notice what I am saying. I am not saying artificial intelligence disappears. I am not saying the technology turns out to be fake. I am saying that a financial model can be catastrophic, even when the underlying invention is real. That is exactly what bubbles do. They take something true and wrap lies around the price. The public tends to think a bubble means an invention itself must be worthless. That is wrong. Most major bubbles are built on something important. The railroad mattered, the internet mattered, the housing stock in America mattered. What failed was the discipline of the people financing and structuring the opportunity. I suspect AI will follow the same broad rhythm. The technology will stay. The excessive promises will not. The next thing I would tell anyone trying to navigate this world is that the labor market story is also being told backwards. People ask what jobs survive as if the future will hand out neat categories. It never does. The future rarely rewards a job title. It rewards adaptive capability. The skill that matters is not memorizing a stable profession. The skill that matters is learning how to move through uncertainty faster and more honestly than the next person. That is why I have an unusual amount of respect for the entrepreneurial mindset, even when it is practiced inside a large institution. I am not talking about the cartoon version of entrepreneurship, where somebody rents a sports car and starts speaking in slogans. I am talking about the very plain, very durable sequence that real builders eventually learn. You look for an opportunity, you test whether anybody actually cares, you find out whether the thing can be built, you find out whether it can be sold, you figure out whether the experience lives up to the promise, you go to market carefully, you scale only after reality has earned your confidence, and when the cycle matures, you redeploy what you learned into the next opportunity. That discipline will matter more in the AI era, not less. The people who get destroyed will be the ones who confuse their own excitement with validation. That mistake has bankrupted more founders than bad luck ever did. They fall in love with the elegance of an idea. They spend before listening. They build before proving demand. They make themselves feel brave by going all in, when in fact they are just refusing to gather information, because information might injure the fantasy. A serious operator behaves differently. A serious operator runs cheap experiments. A serious operator asks the market to vote before ego starts writing checks. A serious operator understands that the shortest path to real confidence is not self-belief. It is contact with reality. I have watched enough businesses over enough decades to know that validation is not a glamorous word, but it is one of the few words that protects capital. If you can put an idea in front of the world with a waiting list, a pilot, a narrow launch, a small paid trial, a prototype, or some other simple test, you can learn more in a week than a romantic dreamer learns in 6 months of late-night theorizing. That matters now because AI has changed the cost of experimentation. It has lowered the price of trying. It has lowered the price of building the first version. It has lowered the price of coding, prototyping, drafting, iterating, researching, packaging, and refining. That is a gift if you remain disciplined. It is a trap if you become lazy. The reason I say that is simple. When the cost of creating falls, two things happen at once. Opportunity goes up, scarcity goes down. Most people only celebrate the first part. I care just as much about the second. For years, software as a service was an elite opportunity because the barriers to entry were real. You needed significant development talent. You needed meaningful capital. You needed a long runway. You needed enough customers to absorb a cost base that would have crushed a small operator. In that world, merely getting a functioning product into the market already created a kind of moat, because few people could even afford the attempt. That world is changing quickly. You can now imagine small niche software businesses serving far fewer customers, costing far less to build, and reaching profitability on a much smaller scale than before. That is genuinely exciting. It means a person with a specific domain insight and a tight sense of a market pain point can turn a playbook into a tool with extraordinary speed. It means a small business can build internal systems that used to require large software budgets. It means a founder can reach product reality without begging for millions, just to get started. I think that is one of the great positive stories of this era. But you must hold the second truth in your head at the same time. If it becomes easy for you to build it, it becomes easier for others to copy it. That means many software products will cheap replaceable. always one update away from feeling ordinary, that changes the entire logic of business building. The tool alone may no longer be enough. The thing you sell may not be the software itself. It may be the software attached to a method, attached to training, attached to community, attached to live support, attached to reputation, attached to a real-world experience, attached to a trusted guide. That is how moats begin to mutate in a world where code itself becomes less scarce. I find this fascinating because it pushes entrepreneurs back toward something older and more human. In the old frame, you won because the product was hard to make. In the new frame, that may not be sufficient. You may have to win because the total experience is hard to. There is a world of difference between an applicant tracking system that merely stores names in a database and an applicant tracking system attached to a hiring philosophy, an operating method, a community of managers, a set of workshops, a retreat, a standard of culture, and a body of experience people trust. The software may open the door. The human system is what persuades people to stay in the room. That same principle is going to show up almost everywhere. Content used to require massive industrial apparatus. Now tiny teams can produce what once would have required a television studio. That sounds liberating, and it is. But when everybody can create, creation itself stops being rare. A great many people will rush into fields that are becoming easier without noticing that the very ease attracting them is simultaneously eroding the value they hope to capture. That is why so many businesses are about to discover that what was once a blue ocean can become crowded faster than old strategic textbooks ever imagined. A marketing agency 10 years ago could occupy a very different competitive position than one does today. The industry was less saturated, the expertise was less widespread, the demand curve felt more forgiving. But once the market notices an attractive pool of profit, imitation arrives. And now imitation is faster because digital tools let competitors replicate the appearance of competence almost instantly. This is the great compression of the AI era. The disruption cycle has shortened. The time between opportunity and competition has collapsed. The room for lazy strategy has narrowed. And that is why I think it is getting harder to build truly large, durable businesses in many categories, even while it is getting easier to build small, good businesses that provide freedom, income, and a satisfying life. That distinction is important. Not everybody wants to build an empire. In fact, very few people do. A great many people would be delighted with a business that lets them work with a small team, live with more flexibility, raise their children without surrendering their whole existence to a desk, and make enough money to live well while doing work that feels interesting and somewhat alive. AI may be a wonderful gift for that kind of builder. It reduces cost. It reduces friction. It broadens the field. It makes modest scale more accessible. But if you are trying to build something very large, you should understand that your enemy is no longer just incompetence. Your enemy is speed of replication that changes how you think. It means the old dream of finding a blue ocean and calmly sailing in it for a decade may be less reliable than it once was. It means your real edge may come less from the static product and more from the constantly renewed system around it. It means your defensibility may depend on staying alive, responsive, and deeply connected to human needs while copycats race after the visible parts of what you do. This is where the conversation becomes more interesting to me, because once you strip away the glamour and fear surrounding AI, the truly durable question is very old. What remains valuable when machines can imitate so much of what used to look impressive? My answer is that we return to what is difficult to fake. Not because it is mystical, because it is embodied. People still need connection. People still need trust. People still need stories that feel lived rather than generated. People still need gatherings, belonging, status within a real community, emotional reassurance, recognition, guidance, and shared experience. you can automate explanation. It is much harder to automate genuine presence. You can automate information. It is much harder to automate the feeling that another human being understands something because he has actually stood inside it. That is why I believe a great deal of value will migrate toward things that are irreplaceably human. Not human in the sentimental sense, human in the practical economic sense. A person can tell me what happened in a city. A different kind of person can tell me what it felt like to live through the event, how it changed his decisions, what it did to his marriage, what it did to his risk tolerance, what he saw in the eyes of the people involved, what he learned after sitting in a room with the consequences. That second thing is harder to copy. It has texture. It has memory. It has cost in it because somebody had to actually live it. That is what I would call personal intellectual capital. Most people overlook it because they think value must look grand in order to matter. They imagine they need to conquer the world, win a Nobel Prize, ring the opening bell on an exchange, or produce something globally famous before their experience becomes commercially meaningful. I do not believe that. I think each person who has paid attention to his own life possesses some body of lived pattern recognition that can be useful to a specific group of people. Sometimes that capital is hidden in a career. Sometimes it is hidden in a failure. Sometimes it is hidden in a strange combination of work, obsession, pain, repetition, and lessons nobody else bothered to organize. The world has a tendency to reward what is relatable more reliably than what is merely impressive. That is one of the most underrated truths in all of media and business. Impressive makes people look, relatable makes them stay. A polished stranger can attract admiration. A recognizable human experience attracts trust. If a man has spent years sitting with lottery winners a week after their lives changed, that is not important because it sounds glamorous. It is important because he has seen something almost nobody else has seen. He has watched what money does to emotion at close range. He has observed behavior in the moment between fantasy and consequence. He can speak not from abstraction, but from accumulated human contact. That is a moat, not because nobody can repeat his words, because nobody else can truthfully own his experience. I suspect this will become one of the most valuable forms of property in the coming decade, not intellectual property in the legal sense alone. Personal intellectual property, your way of seeing, your sequence of lessons, your tested playbooks, your record of what you have done, survived, built, ruined, repaired, and understood. And here is the beautiful part. AI can help you package that. It can help you organize it, distribute it, turn it into products, shape it into software, training, communities, events, frameworks, tools, and systems. But it cannot give you the life that made it true in the first place. That distinction gives me a great deal of optimism. It means the answer to the AI age is not to become less human. It is to become more specific, more honest, more grounded, more observant, more willing to convert lived experience. And this also changes how I think about education. If a young person asked me what he should learn in a world of accelerating automation, I would not tell him to chase some static, safe profession as though the future were a locked cabinet. I would tell him to learn how value is created from uncertainty, learn how to identify a problem, learn how to test a market, learn how to build a first version, learn how to sell honestly, learn how to refine based on feedback, learn how to create an offering that lives up to its promise, learn how to operate with speed without lying to yourself. That sequence will outlive many job descriptions. It is not glamorous, but glamour has never been a good substitute for utility. I would also tell him to study people. Study what they truly want, not what they claim to admire. People say they want innovation, but often they want reassurance. People say they want genius, but often they want recognition. People say they want information, but often they want interpretation by somebody they trust. People say they want efficiency, but often they want a feeling of progress. The person who can read those distinctions clearly will have an edge long after the novelty of any one tool has faded. Another point worth making is that abundance creates a surprising hunger for embodiment. Throughout history, societies, under pressure and intense competition, have repeatedly produced more rituals, more gatherings, more festivals, more communal experiences. That is not accidental. It reflects something fundamental. Human beings do not merely want output. They want shared meaning. They want moments that make life feel inhabited rather than merely processed. We have built cities full of convenience and loneliness. We have built digital systems full of access and fragmentation. We have made information abundant and intimacy scarce. I would not be surprised if one of the great businesses of the future is the intelligent combination of software, media, community, and real-world gatherings into one living system that keeps renewing itself, not a conference alone, not software alone, not media alone, but an integrated experience, a thing that helps people do something better, understand something better, meet each other in the process, and attach their identity to a group that feels real. That may not look like the classic moat drawn in old business school case studies, but it may prove harder to dislodge than many of the businesses currently receiving heroic valuations for the simple act of owning compute. That is the irony of this period. The market may be overpaying for what is easiest to describe in futuristic language and underestimating what is oldest, messiest, and most human. It would not be the first time Wall Street has always had an easier time valuing a spreadsheet than a relationship. It has always found it easier to put a multiple on a narrative about scale than on a quiet system of trust. And yet, over a long enough period, trust monetized intelligently can be one of the greatest businesses in the world. That is why I would be very careful about where I place my admiration. The crowd admires size. I admire durable economics. The crowd admires novelty. I admire repeat behavior. The crowd admires speed. I admire earned staying power. The crowd admires technical sophistication. I admire the ability to keep solving a real human problem in a way that produces cash without requiring fantasy to sustain it. So when I look at AI, I see two worlds at once. In one world, too much capital is being committed to infrastructure whose useful life is shorter than the story being told about it. That world could end in painful financial repricing. I would not be shocked if history eventually records this as one of those periods when society built something real through a financing structure that was wildly overconfident. In the other world, millions of smaller operators gain leverage that was previously inaccessible. They build narrow software. They test ideas quickly. They serve tiny niches well. They package experience into products. They create communities around playbooks. They use machines to handle what is generic so they can spend more of their time on what is personal, interpretive, relational, and real. I think both worlds are arriving at the same time. That is what makes this period so confusing. A technology can produce a capital market disaster at one layer and a small business renaissance at another. A giant company can overbuild itself into mediocre returns, while an individual with a useful playbook and a specific audience quietly builds a beautiful life. A sector can be overhyped in the stock market and still underexploited in the hands of practical operators. Those are not contradictions. They are usually how revolutions look from the inside. People love clean stories. Reality rarely provides them. So if I were forced to summarize the whole moment in plain language, I would say this: do not confuse a remarkable invention with a sound investment. Do not confuse easier creation with durable value. Do not confuse broad access with defensibility. Do not confuse impressive scale with intelligent capital allocation. And above all, do not forget that whenever a machine makes the generic cheaper, the specific human thing on the other side often becomes more valuable. I have never believed that the best response to change is panic. The best response is clearer thinking. If AI improves by small percentages that compound, many astonishing things will happen. But clear thinking still requires us to ask what is being built, who is paying, how often the assets must be replaced, whether the customers truly value, and whether the economics work without grand delusion. Clear thinking also requires us to ask what cannot be automated so easily. A body in a room, a trusted guide, a lived story, a community that actually knows each other, a method shaped by experience, a taste for reality, a habit of testing rather than fantasizing, a willingness to choose a small good business over a large bad dream. Those things may not sound futuristic enough for television. They sound plenty futuristic to me because most people still do not practice them. And that is how I would prepare for the next 10 years. I would keep one eye on the capital cycle and one eye on the human need. I would be suspicious of any boom that demands faith in spending today while promising to explain the profits later. I would be eager to use AI as a lever for experimentation, but reluctant to worship it as a final answer. I would build faster, but only after asking the market to speak. I would care less about looking important and more about being useful. I would search my own life for the playbooks no machine can invent on my behalf. I would remember that the world does not merely reward the most advanced tool. It often rewards the person who can connect the tool to a real need, a real relationship, and a real experience. If this age ends with giant financial disappointment in some of the most celebrated parts of AI infrastructure, that will not surprise me. If this same age also creates an enormous wave of small, profitable, nimble businesses built by people who combine software with community, training, lived insight, and authentic human connection, that will not surprise me either. In fact, I think those two outcomes belong together. That is the shape of many transitions. Too much money floods the top of the story. The real value gets built quietly underneath by operators who never mistake possibility for economics. That is where I would rather live, not in the loudest promise, in the sober opportunity, not in the worship of intelligence as spectacle, in the patient construction of usefulness, not in the fantasy that technology eliminates human advantage, in the understanding that technology often reveals where human advantage was hiding all along. And if I had to make one final bet, it would be this: the next decade will punish people who only know how to consume intelligence. It will reward people who know how to turn intelligence into judgment, judgment into action, action into trust, and trust into something others are glad to pay for. That is still a very human business. It always was.